Hello guys, good morning. So as usual, another day of online class. So apparently if you haven't heard, online class is will be extended for another 2 weeks. So I guess I won't be seeing you guys until April. But maybe it will be better that way. It would be more safer. So just hang in there. As long as you guys are up to date with the video and then always communicate with me if there's problems, so you should be on the right track at the moment. Okay, all right. Now so previously, just to recap what we did already, we have covered about variables, IVs and DVs. I've introduced that to you. We also have covered on types of hypothesis, directional, non-directional, and null hypothesis. We also did operationalization. So well done to everyone who have submitted the work. To those who haven't, I'm still waiting on that work. So please submit it. Okay, right. So this next topic, we will be looking at the real research method itself. So basically, we will be looking at different types of method that psychologists use to do their research. Okay, so I will divide this lesson into different sections. So research method, we will cover about experimental methods, which is today we're going to cover on that. There's also non-experimental method, and data analysis would be about statistics ito, yung mean, median, and mode. And then lastly, we would cover on ethics, okay? So as of today, we're going to do experimental method and one non-experimental method for today, okay? Alright, so research studies ada two types. We have experimental studies and we have non-experimental method studies. Okay, so research studies it can be experimental, it can be non-experimental. So I'm gonna next define what is experimental method and what is non-experimental method. Okay. Alright, now how do psychologists investigate their hypothesis? So first thing, psychologists, when they come up with a hypothesis already, they have to collect data to prove their hypothesis is correct or not. So how do they investigate that? Is by doing research, okay? So, research method tadi I said ada experimental, ada non-experimental. So let me just explain first what is experimental method. Now from the word itself, it's an experiment. That's why it's experimental methods, okay? So it's an experiment that involves the manipulation of independent variables to see what effect it has on dependent variable. So basically, experiment it means that the researcher are manipulating the IV. So I already teach you what is IV, right? IV is the variable that can be manipulated, and then DV is the results of that manipulation. So experimental method will have IV, will also have DV. Okay, so this is the definition for experimental method. Okay, there is manipulation of IV to see its effects on the DV. Kalau non-experimental method, there's no manipulation of IV and DV. So experimental method ada IV, ada DV. Non-experimental method, there's no IV and DV. Okay, so that's the difference. Now, experimental method ada three types. So experiment, there are three types of experiment, which I will elaborate in the next slide, okay? Alright, so first type of experiment, this is very common, very well known. I'm pretty sure you have heard or probably have seen lab experiment before. So first types of experimental method is lab experiment, where the researcher deliberately manipulates the IV. So researcher controls the independent variables, okay? And also lab experiment is conducted in an artificial setting. So it is conducted in a lab where it's controlled, it's made up, okay? It's artificial setting. Now, the next type of experiment is in the next slide. So next type of experiment is field experiment. This is the opposite to lab. So if you look at the picture there, that is an example of a setting for a field experiment, which is in a subway. So field experiment ini, it's not artinya eksperimen itu was conducted in a field. Okay, it's not like that. Field experiment means that the experiment was carried out in a natural environment. So di luar, outside of a lab. Like for example, in a subway car or in a shopping mall, in school, just in any natural environment. And then if there is manipulation of IV and then it was conducted in a natural environment, artinya it's a field experiment. Okay? Kalau lab experiment, manipulation of the IV tapi it's inside a lab or inside an artificial setting. Okay? So field artinya di luar. Bukan arah field, in a natural environment, in any environment yang outside. Okay? Alright. Now, the third types of experimental method is natural experiment, or also known as quasi-experiment. Okay, this one, it doesn't have anything to do with the setting, either the lab ka or outside. It doesn't have to do with that. Natural experiment is when, if you look at the bullet point, it takes place in circumstances which allow the researcher to examine the effects of naturally occurring IV. So meaningnya, there is independent variable still, but the independent variable, it occurs naturally. It doesn't have to be manipulated by the researcher. Or if you look at the second bullet point, often used where artificial manipulation would be impossible or unethical. So researcher cannot manipulate that variable, because if they manipulate, either it's impossible or it's unethical. Okay. Now, can you think of what variable yang it's not possible to manipulate? Okay. Now, there are actually quite a lot of variables that can be studied, but it's impossible to manipulate. For example, gender. Okay. Say I want to study the differences between male and female. Okay. But I cannot say, okay, for example, a group of male. I cannot say, okay, now I want to manipulate you guys. I want you to become female. It's impossible, right? Impossible to change that because it's already natural inside of the participant. Their gender is natural. So you can study it, but you cannot manipulate it. But it is still considered as an IV, because you still can compare between the gender, right? But the difference is you cannot manipulate it because it occurs naturally. Okay? Another example yang you cannot manipulate would be, besides gender, personality. Like you have introvert and extrovert. You want to study that. But again, it's impossible to manipulate it. You cannot say to an extrovert to become an introvert. Okay? It occurs naturally. All you have to do is study saja and compare your findings. Okay? Another thing like intelligent, anything, any variables that the person are born with, you cannot manipulate it. You can just study it. You can still compare it. It's still considered as an IV. The difference is it's an IV that occurs naturally and cannot be manipulated. So if that happened in a study, if a study is examining something that occurs naturally, like gender, it is considered as a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment, because IV is impossible to manipulate. But there is still IV. It's just that IV-nya occurs naturally. Okay? So I hope that's clear. So there are three types of experimental method: lab experiment, field experiment, and natural/quasi-experiment. Okay? So please remember these three, the definition, and what it means. So you need to know how to define each type of experimental method. Okay? Okay, now a mini task for you to do in your own group. I know here it says be in pair, but it's okay. Just be in your group that you the same group, yung last time, yung empat orang ito, the four of you. So the same group, I want you guys to find out two advantages or two disadvantages of using lab experiment and field experiment. So that means you need to have 4 points for lab, 4 points for field, two advantages and two disadvantages. Okay, so just discuss it. I know you can Google it if you want to Google it, but if you Google it, make sure you do understand what the Google are saying instead of just copy pasting it. Or you can do a discussion with your teammates. Like just think, um, use your brain, think about it. Okay, kalon lab, what could be the advantage? What could be the disadvantage if you're using a lab experiment? Like I think it's something that you can discuss and you can think without having to Google it. Okay, but if it's like if you feel that it's difficult to think, then go ahead and Google, but make sure you do know what you are Googling. Okay, you do know what it means, because again, I'm gonna ask you to share it macam last time through audio. Okay, so probably we will do the sharing session on Monday. So after this lesson, just prepare and discuss on this. Okay, all right. So we're done with experimental method. Now we're gonna move on to non-experimental method. So non-experimental method is actually way more than experimental. Experimental ada 3 saja. Non-experimental, there's 5 of it. Okay, and there's a lot of branches under non-experimental method. So for today, I'm just gonna cover on one saja, one non-experimental method, which is observation. Okay. So I guess this one is actually very well known, Joa. This is a very common research method that is used by researcher, and I'm pretty sure you would know already how observation works. So observation, the definition in psychology is it involves the precise measurement of a naturally occurring behavior in an objective way. So the definition is they are measuring a natural behavior in an objective way. So it's not subjective, it shouldn't be biased, the observation shouldn't be biased, it should be structured. Okay, it should be specific, structured what they are observing. It shouldn't be macam antam-antam. So that's not an observation where you do just randomly watch people. That is observing people not in a scientific way. But in a scientific way, you should be observing them in a specific manner, um, with a schedule, with you would know what you want to observe. It shouldn't be random. Okay. So observation, the definition is this bullet point. Okay. Now, there are 3 types of observation. Same thing macam lab ada 3 types. Observation also ada 3 types. So naturalistic observation is the first one. So the picture actually illustrate naturalistic observation. So if you have a look at the picture, the first picture, the researcher was sitting there and observing the animal in the jungle itself. And then in the second picture, you call it stalking. I call it naturalistic observation. So it's something like that. When you stalk people, but stalk in an objective way lah, then it's a naturalistic observation. Kalau macam stalking like in a freaky way, so that's not naturalistic observation. Okay, and then the third picture there, observation inside a classroom, is also considered as naturalistic observation. Okay, let's go through the definition. It means that it involves recording of spontaneously occurring behavior in the subject's own natural environment without interference from the researcher in either social or physical environment. So it's still the same definition. You are recording spontaneous behavior, but in the subject punya natural behavior. Okay, like if you see the animal was observed inside the jungle, and then the student was observed inside the classroom. So it's in the natural behavior without interference from the researcher. So researchers are just observing and not being involved in the environment. Okay, they would just sit and watch saja. So that's the definition for naturalistic observation. Now, next one is controlled observation. This is from the word itself, it's controlled. Okay, let's go through the definition. It's still the same definition from the beginning. Involve the recording of spontaneously occurring behavior, but the differences is it was done under unnatural condition manipulated by the researcher. So if you see in the picture there, they were observed inside an artificial setting, like inside a lab, and then the researcher would be observing through a one-way mirror. So we call that mirror, I'm pretty sure you have seen it in movies. That mirror, only the researcher can see them. They cannot see the researcher. We call that mirror as a one-way mirror. Okay, so yeah, it's considered as unnatural condition because they are doing it inside a lab. So hence, that's why it's a control observation. So the second bullet point there, it can be conducted in either participant normal environment or artificial situation. It's true. Like here, it's an artificial situation because it's inside the lab. It's not something that they do at home. But it says there, it can be either in participant normal environment. Like, what this means is, for example, it was conducted at home, okay, in a normal environment, but the setting of the house was manipulated by the researcher. For example, they set up cameras, they set up CCTV. It makes the environment becomes artificial, okay. So hence, that's why kalau the researcher uses observation through cameras or through CCTV, that is still, even though it was conducted at home, but that is still considered as a control observation, okay? Because it's not natural. Like, I'm pretty sure you don't have camera inside your room, right? You don't have people observing you through camera. So that would be not normal, right? So if that happened, that is considered as control observation. And another example of control observation is observation carried out in a lab. So that's a common one lah. Control observation usually was conducted inside the lab. Okay, now the third types of observation, we have participant observation. So the picture itself, again, illustrate the definition of participant observation. So the first picture there, you have a kid trying to become one of the bird, I guess, acting like the bird. And then a second picture, again, the researcher becoming involved. The researcher are involved with the subject itself there. They become one of them. And the same thing with the third picture there. The researcher are involved with the subjects, okay? So participant observation means the researcher becoming involved in the everyday life of the subject, either with or without their knowledge. So basically, the researcher becomes part of the subject. So either they live there, they live with the participant, they acted like the participant. This is with or without their knowledge. Sometimes they would tell that they are observing, sometimes they don't tell that they are observing. But if the researcher, if you notice, kalau naturalistic, then the researcher are not involving in the environment. They just watch from far saja. So the difference is, kalau participant, the researcher are there and they are involved with them. Okay? Hence, that's why it is called as participant observation, because the researcher are involved in the life of the subject while observing them. Okay? So 3 types of observation that you need to know with its definition: naturalistic observation, control observation, and participant observation. Okay? Okay, so this is the additional key terms that relates to observation that you also need to know. First one is unstructured observation. Unstructured observation means that a study in which observer records their whole range of possible behavior, which is confined to a pilot stage at the beginning of a study to refine the behavioral categories to be observed. Okay, later I'll explain what is a behavioral categories. So unstructured observation means they just observe any possible behavior. So whatever the participants are doing, those are the one that they record. Okay, so usually they do this at the beginning of the study to sort of categorize the behavior that they want to look at in the real studies. Okay, so unstructured observation, usually they do it at the beginning just to like find out what is the common behavior that they will see during that observation. So unstructured mean recording any possible behavior. Okay, and then structured observation is the opposite. Structured is when the observer records only a limited range of behavior. So they don't just record everything and anything. They specifically state, okay, these are the behavior that I want to record. These are the things that I will observe saja. So for example, observing children playing in a playground. So I want to do structured observation where I just want to count how many times a kid play with the slides. Okay, so specifically I just want to observe that, which means that any other behavior, any other things that the children play with, I will not observe, I will not record. I just focus on recording how many times do they go on that slides. Okay, so that is an example of structured observation. It means that I'm only recording a limited range of behavior according to what I want to observe. If unstructured mean I just observe everything, like the kid play di mana, I observe, like play with the slides, play with the swing, I observe everything, I record everything. Okay, that's unstructured. And then behavioral categories is basically is a tool. It's a tool for you to record the observation. So the activities recorded in an observation, it's like a checklist. Okay, just imagine behavioral categories like you have a paper where you would pick the behavior that you observe. Like for example, how many times the kid goes on the slide, then you like mark it on that paper. Okay, so that paper, behavioral categories, and there's different categories already. Like for example, going on a slide is the first category. Second category, maybe playing with the swing. Third category, running with the other kids. Fourth category, sitting down, just sitting down. Okay, so behavioral category is where behavior are already categorized, and then I will observe based on the categories that are listed in on that paper. So any other behavior that are not inside that behavioral categories will not be recorded. Okay, so if you see there, they should be operationalized, so clearly defined, and should break a continuous stream of activity into discrete recordable events. They must be observable action rather than inferred state. So behavioral categories, the word behavior means that you need to put all the behavior young people can observe on that piece of paper. Okay, on that behavioral categories. So just think of behavioral categories like a checklist. Like a checklist of behavior that will be observed, and that paper will be used to record that behavior. Okay, alright, so next one, covert observer. Covert and is the opposite to overt. Covert mean the observer is not obvious, either they are hidden or they are disguised. Okay, so I think this is easy to understand. Basically, observer, they are hiding somewhere, the researcher cannot see them, or they were disguised. So again, participant doesn't know who the researcher is. And then overt is the opposite. Overt observer is when the observer is obvious to the participant. Okay, like for example, I'm pretty sure you have been in a classroom where there is another teacher observing the class. So we call that teacher, observing at the back considered as an overt observer, where the participant know that the person is an observer. Okay, so covert and overt observer. Alright, so that's basically it for today. I just want to cover on types of experiment and type of observation. So right now you go ahead, go communicate with your teammates and do the classwork that I gave, the 2 advantage and the 2 disadvantage. If you have any problem, again, same thing, just text me up, okay? So yeah, thank you for today. I'll talk to you again on Saturday where we will share your findings on advantages and the 2 disadvantages. Okay? All right.